we plan and teach our English language courses and lessons, our focus is usually on the different types of activities we're going to use and the materials we're going to use in order to meet student learning needs. Lost in this focus on the teaching and learning process is the impact that context has on what we do in the language classroom. And this impact is actually a lot stronger than we might think. Through the analysis of different teaching contexts from around the world, we're going to talk about the impact that context does have on what we do as language teachers. We'll see how where we teach very strongly influences how we teach. We'll come at this issue of context from three different angles: from the context of the physical environment and the organizational environment or context, and finally from the cultural context. We'll start the discussion by taking a look at why we just can't avoid the context as English language teachers. We'll take a very brief look at the complexity theory as a way of understanding the interaction between context and teaching and learning. We'll take a look at the influences of context on that teaching and learning process. And finally, we'll look at context from those three different angles: the physical environment, the organizational context, and the cultural context. Why is context important to us as English language teachers? In other words, why does where we teach influence how we teach? I'll illustrate this through a few different stories from my personal experience and also from the experience of some of our trainers. For the past several years, we've been sending teams of trainers into a small rural community, Kivumu, in Rwanda. The very first time we sent a team of trainers in, we really didn't know what to expect. We had no idea what our trainers would encounter and which activities would work and which wouldn't. So we basically sent them equipped with everything we could possibly think of that they might be able to use. And their job was just to try everything out and see what worked and what didn't work. The second time we sent a team of trainers in, we thought we knew what we were doing, and we thought we could benefit from that first experience and really plan a solid, effective curriculum for the training program. The only thing that we changed that was maybe a little bit uncertain is we sent the trainers in 2 weeks earlier than usual. This small change, interestingly enough, created a big challenge for us. Unknown to us, by sending our trainers in 2 weeks earlier, they were now catching the end of the rainy season. The first team, by going 2 weeks later, were actually there during the dry season. So we had a little bit of a surprise waiting for those two trainers. The facilities the trainers were using in Kivumu had steel roofs. And the other interesting and pertinent point about the context was there was no electricity. So once the sun went down, that was it, or you could use candles. The very first day of the training session, everything was going wonderfully, and the trainers thought, yep, we've got a good program here and it's going to be a great 4 weeks. And then about mid-afternoon, the rain started. I don't know if you've ever been underneath a steel roof when it's raining, and not just a little bit of rain, I'm talking a lot of rain. Well, it created a lot of noise. And then, because it was so cloudy and overcast, there was no daylight to work with. So we had originally planned to have our listening and speaking classes in the afternoon. Well, because it was raining every afternoon and was hugely noisy and very dark, we kind of had to put that plan aside. The trainers came up with a great idea of having very, very loud singing and dancing sessions instead. We've also sponsored training teams to go into a small community in Bolivia. The community is called Rurenabake. We shorten it to Rure because that's much easier to say. The main source of income in Rure is ecotourism. The community is situated on the edge of the jungle and the pampas, so it's ideally positioned to offer really cutting-edge ecotourism. One of the challenges the ecotourism guides have, however, is the English language. So one of our ACE graduates put together a project to teach English for tourism to the local tour guides. The teams that have gone into Rure have also encountered contextual challenges, and these challenges have centered around finding suitable classroom space. the whole community has become involved in finding good classrooms for this project. Some of the classrooms they have come up with have been, let's say, less than ideal. One of the classrooms looked great. It was a big space and they had tables and chairs, but it was used as a storage space for wheat. Well, unknown to the teachers, the wheat was very attractive to mice. So the teachers went in prior to the first day of class and they realized they needed to do a little bit of cleanup here and there. So they got to work. They cleaned up the classroom space, got rid of all the evidence that the mice had been there, and they made a really good classroom. Unfortunately, the mice didn't get the idea that they were no longer welcome. So the continual presence of this mice evidence turned out to be a problem. So they started to look for more classroom space or different classroom space. The next classroom they came up with was on the second floor of a building. And it was pretty hot in Rory at that time. We all know what happens with hot air. It rises. So the poor teachers and the poor students were just like sweating, beads of sweat dropping off of them and dripping everywhere. Not a very good teaching context. So they looked once again for different classroom space. The next classroom option looked pretty good. It was on the ground floor and there was no evidence of mice anywhere. Unfortunately, on the first day of classes, they discovered another problem. The classroom was right next to the local taxi stand. And the taxi drivers, when they weren't out driving, had the TV and the radio on quite loud. The trainers decided that they would have to try and adapt to this particular contextual issue. So they put strategies into place in order to overcome that very loud background noise. For another one of our international projects, we sponsored a teacher to go down to an orphanage in Guatemala, just outside of Guatemala City, to teach English to young learners. She had a really interesting adventure down there. She was teaching with almost no resources and no curriculum. But her biggest challenge was actually a contextual challenge. She was in a classroom that had only one wall, the wall where the blackboard was. The other 3 walls were completely open. She thought initially that, hey, this would be great. She'd get lots of fresh air and it wouldn't get too hot in the classroom. She had contextual challenges, however, when it came to student discipline. One of the back walls, one of the open walls, looked onto the nearby soccer field. So when she came to dish out some punishment to students who weren't focusing, she couldn't use what she wanted to use, which was having a student go stand in the corner. This was supposed to be a punishment. Stand in the corner until you figured out how to behave and then come back to your seat. Well, kids really enjoyed standing in the corner because they got to watch the soccer games that were in progress. So this teacher had to come up with some other discipline strategies that were actually a disciplinary action rather than a reward. These are all fairly extreme examples of different contexts that we encounter as English language teachers. Other contexts might be any of the following. We're teaching in colleges, universities, workplace settings, in small towns, in big cities, in countries where there's a lot of resources put towards education, in countries where there are no resources put towards education. So the English language is taught in many different contexts. And as our examples illustrated, those contexts affect how we teach. Before we look any more about how context influences the learning and teaching process, we're going to take a very small tangent. We're going to take a look at a theory that can help us understand the dynamics when teaching meets context. This theory is called the complexity theory. The complexity theory helps us to understand how organizations function and thrive in a very dynamic, ever-changing environment. The complexity theory helps us to uncover the different factors and influences that mutually influence or change each other as an organization functions on a daily basis. So at the core of the complexity theory is this idea that every organization has different factors or influences that drive it forward as it functions. And these influences are always changing each other. So factor A is influencing factor B, and factor B is influencing factor D, and it's going back and forth, kind of in this crazy spiderwebby kind of way. If we apply the complexity theory to a teaching organization, some of the factors that are kind of intertwining and mutually influencing each other include the context, the students, the materials, the funders, and the technologies. All of these interweave to affect the ultimate teaching outcomes. When we go back to our original question about the influence of context on how we teach, the complexity theory helps us understand what's going on. So we've got a mutual influencing going back and forth. Our teaching is sometimes influencing the context, so we have a little bit of control as a teacher over the context, and then our context is in turn influencing how we teach. Another way to think about this is that our teaching is at the core of an onion, and so the teaching occurs within these other outer layers of context. We can break down the influence of context on teaching into three main categories. The first category is that the context can enable our teaching. It can make our teaching easier and more effective. So our context helps us go in this particular direction with our teaching. The second way that context can influence our teaching is it can kind of act as a barrier or a break. So if we're trying to go in this direction with our teaching, the context can push back, and it can either make us go backwards in the worst of contexts, or it can slow us down, or it can stop us. The third way that context can influence our teaching is it can kind of act as a roadblock or a barrier. It doesn't actually push back against us, it's just immovable and we can't do anything about it. So in this case, if we want to take our teaching this way, but we encounter the context, we might have to adapt our teaching and kind of make a detour around that context in order to accomplish our teaching goals. Now that we've looked at the three ways that context can influence our teaching, either by enabling it, slowing or stopping it, or being a complete roadblock, we're going to take a look at context from those three different angles that I mentioned in the introduction to the video. We're going to take a look at the physical environment, the organizational context, and the cultural context. Let's start with the physical environment in which we're teaching. We can break this down into four more categories just to really get our heads around how this particular aspect or angle of context influences our teaching. We can break it down into location, so the classroom setting that we're in, the seating that we have, the writing surface that we have to work with, and then other environmental factors. These are categories that really significantly influence the teaching and learning process. The first category or subcategory in the physical environment is the location or the classroom setting. So here are some variations that we might encounter. We might have a small classroom or a very large classroom. We might have a lecture hall, a lunchroom, a computer lab, or a gymnasium. Our classroom setting really influences how much space we have to work with. So obviously in a small classroom our space is restricted, and in a larger classroom we've got a lot of space, so we can have our students up and moving around a bit more. A lecture hall influences our teaching in a different way. A lecture hall really puts the center of attention on the teacher, which is not what we always want in an English language teaching context, so we might have to work around that somehow. A lunchroom offers a lot of distractions, unfortunately. There might be stoves and microwaves and fridges and all sorts of other stuff going on. A computer lab can be a very difficult context in which to teach because it really restricts the amount of movement your students have. It's very hard to move them around in a computer lab. A gymnasium is the opposite problem. There's just so much space to work with and so much echo going on that it is once again quite challenging to teach in this situation. The next component or category of the physical environment that influences the teaching and learning process is the seating that's available. You might have individual desks and chairs, movable or unmovable desks and chairs, a boardroom table and chairs, desk-chair combos that are all attached, group tables and chairs, or computer stations. Individual desks and chairs can present a challenge because there's not a lot of work surface for students to use. If you have movable desks and chairs, you have a lot more options in terms of how you group and arrange your students. With unmovable desks and chairs, it is quite challenging to do small group work, for example. A boardroom table presents a challenge because there's usually a large distance between students who are facing each other, and so they sort of have to yell across this boardroom table to make themselves heard. The desk-chair combos are also challenging because, quite frankly, they're not that secure. They're a little bit on the rickety side. And once again, there's not a lot of workspace for students. Group tables and chairs can be really good for small group work, but when you have students do individual work, they might get distracted by the other people at their table. Computer stations are perhaps the most challenging. There's usually not a lot of maneuverability around the computers. The computers are usually secured in one place, and often there are little cubicle things that students have to yell over, or you have to kind of peek around to see what students are doing. Teacher writing surface is the next category or factor under the physical environment that can influence how we teach. You might have a blackboard, a whiteboard, a smartboard, no board at all, flip charts, or a computer and an LCD projector. Each of these writing surfaces offers you, first of all, a different amount of writing space to be able to project to the students at any one time. You also have different challenges with writing tools. We all know how wonderful it is to work with chalk and get chalk dust all over you. We all know that whiteboard markers inevitably run out right in the middle of an important lesson. And we all know the same thing with flip chart paper. Just when we need it, we've run out of flip chart paper. And finally, computers and LCDs are great, but sometimes they don't work. And the same thing with smartboards. If you have no boards at all, that's another challenge altogether. You simply have to find other ways to present visual information to your students. The final category under the physical environment is other factors. This includes room temperature, lighting, noise level, windows, wall color, and air quality. If the room temperature is off, students may be too hot or too cold, and therefore will have trouble focusing. If the lighting is not good, they'll have trouble focusing once again, and reading will be a challenge. If the noise level is too high, students are going to have to speak up in order to be heard. If there are no windows, then fresh air can be a challenge if the ventilation system in the room is not that good. Wall color is an interesting one that interior decorators would be very happy that I've included here. Wall color can actually set the emotional mood or the tone of your class. Finally, air quality speaks for itself. If students are breathing quality air, they're going to feel more alert and more refreshed. Let's move on to take a look at the organizational context and how this might influence the teaching and learning process. We can divide the organizational context into 6 categories or subcategories. These categories are the purpose for the organization, the funding of the organization, the structure of the organization, the policies and procedures, the relationships and the politics, and finally, the company culture. There's a wide variety of organizations that actually offer English language instruction. From the perspective of purpose, these organizations can be divided into 2 main groups. On the one hand, there are the for-profit organizations whose mandate it is to make money, and there are the non-profit or the not-for-profit organizations who don't have a money-making mandate. We can also divide these organizations into 2 groups based upon their funding models. There are 2 main funding models for English language teaching organizations. The first is a government funding model, and the second is a fee-paying model. So in the first, a government or a government organization provides the funds for the organization to function. In the second, students at some point pay some kind of fee. There are also sometimes hybrid models with a little bit of funding and a little bit of fee paying. When it comes to organizational structure, there are once again two groups that we can put our organizations into. The first group are the hierarchical organizations. These organizations are very much structured like a pyramid, and people report up all the way to a top person right at the top of the pyramid. The second group is the flat organizations. These organizations don't have a lot of reporting upward, they have a lot of reporting sideways. Okay, so there is usually someone in charge at the top, but it's not quite like this, it's more like this. An organization's policies and procedures significantly impact the teaching and learning process. We can divide these policies and procedures into four groups: classes, class placement, teaching, and curriculum. Let's take a look at each of these. Policies and procedures about classes can include answers to the following questions. What size are the classes? How long are the classes? How many classes do students have per week? How long is the term? At what point in the term are students admitted to the class? Here are some of the class placement policies and procedures. Which students are eligible for the class? How are students placed in the class? How do students move up to a higher class? Here are some of the teaching policies and procedures to think about. How is good teaching defined? How is good teaching measured? How are teachers rewarded for good teaching? How is teacher professional development supported? And finally, here are some of the curriculum policies and procedures. How is the curriculum structured? What textbooks, materials, and technologies are mandated or required? What is the feedback loop on the curriculum? So how do teachers provide feedback on that curriculum to bring about change? And how are decisions about the curriculum made? Employer and employee relationships and the politics of a whole organization significantly impact the teaching and learning process. Here's why. If an organization has a good set of relationships between the employer and the employees, then employees, the teachers in this case, are actually very happy to be there, be at the organization. They're also very happy to teach well, and they get rewarded for teaching well. They get a lot of recognition. If, on the other hand, there's an acrimonious relationship between the employer and the employees, the teachers, don't want to be there. They put in minimal effort and really don't care about the quality of their teaching because they know they're probably not going to get any recognition for it. The politics of an organization also comes into play here. By politics, I mean who within the organization has power and how is that power used. Is that power used effectively and for the benefit of the students in the organization, or is it used ineffectively and to the detriment of the organization? Organizations with poisonous politics have a lot of abuse of power or misuse of power going on. People with no power feel quite helpless and don't feel like they have any control over making themselves a better work environment. If we're talking about teachers in this case, the teachers then don't feel like there's any point in being good teachers. If, on the other hand, the politics of an organization are good, in other words, there's no misuse or abuse of power, then employees, the teachers in this case, feel really comfortable going to work, they want to be there, and they want to do a good job. Somewhat related to the relationships and politics of an organization is the organization's culture. And there are two main groups of organizations here when it comes to culture. There are the collaborative organizations where people get rewarded and feel good about sharing. Okay, so in a teaching context, teachers share a lot of ideas, they share lesson plans, and they share resources. On the other hand, there are organizations that have a competitive company culture. Everyone else is always trying to beat the other person. For teachers, this means that there's no collaboration because if you help someone, that might mean that they get ahead of you. This was just a really brief overview of organizational context and how the issues within that context can either positively or negatively impact the teaching and learning processes. Organizational context is, however, much more complex. If you're interested in delving into this complexity, I would suggest a course in organizational behavior or different textbooks on organizational behavior. Each organization that offers English language teaching is also situated within a larger cultural context. We're going to look at some of the key factors within that cultural context that influence the teaching and learning processes. The first factor within a cultural context that influences the teaching and learning process is how that culture positions knowledge versus performance. So knowledge is exactly as it sounds, it's knowing something. Performance, on the other hand, is being able to apply something or use something. Cultures differ then in terms of the type of emphasis their education systems place on knowledge versus performance. In an English language teaching context, if a culture places a lot of emphasis on knowledge, students will do a lot of memorization and rote learning of the language. On the other hand, if a culture places a lot of emphasis on performance, students will do a lot of application of the language, or they'll be expected to use the language in real situations or real contexts. Another way that the cultural context can differ is in terms of the emphasis or importance placed on the individual versus the group. In cultures where the education system places emphasis on the individual, students expect to do a lot of individual work when they're in class, and they're very proud of individual achievement. On the other hand, in a culture whose education system places emphasis on the group, students do a lot of collaborative work and teamwork, and they're also evaluated as a group as opposed to being evaluated as an individual. The next way in which cultures differ is actually a really interesting one. There are cultures where there's a lot of value placed on taking a risk. So these are risk-taking cultures. Then there are cultures where a lot of value is placed on being safe, and so these are the risk-averse cultures. In an English language teaching context, the risk-taking versus risk-averse cultural difference gives us quite a difference in terms of student behavior in the classroom. In a risk-taking culture, students will be completely willing to try. They'll always jump in and try whatever you as the teacher ask them to do, and they don't care if they make mistakes. They just fix them and move on. In a risk-averse culture, on the other hand, students don't like to make mistakes. They don't like to try something unless they have a really solid understanding of every single step that they have to do. The next cultural difference that you might see in different cultural contexts is all about power. So we have what are called high power distance cultures and low power distance cultures. In a high power distance culture, it's completely acceptable for someone who has a lot of power to show that they have power. And that person expects other people to acknowledge that power. On the other hand, in a low power distance culture, it's not acceptable to show that you have a lot of power, and other people actually won't really acknowledge that you do have any kind of power over them. What does this look like in an English language classroom? In a high power distance culture, the teacher will expect students to acknowledge his or her authority. Students may do things like bow when the teacher comes into the classroom or sit silently until called upon by the teacher. And the teacher is considered to be the knower, so students don't challenge the teacher at all. The teacher is the one asking the questions, and the students answer those questions. In a low power distance culture, even though the teacher does have authority over students, students don't have to do a lot of bowing and scraping or anything like that. Students and teachers have a very equal or friendly relationship. And the teacher doesn't always expect to be the expert in this situation. Students can ask questions anytime they want, and they can also disagree with the teacher if they want. The final cultural difference we'll look at in terms of cultural context is the emphasis or the importance placed on creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving. In some cultures, creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving are really important. Students learn these skills right from the age of 4 or 5, and they practice them all the way through elementary school, high school, college, or university. On the other hand, there are cultures that don't place any importance on creativity, critical thinking, or problem solving. These cultures just use rote learning. Students learn the information and then prove that they've learned the information, and that's all that's required of them as students. This cultural difference is particularly important when your students are looking to move on to higher education studies in an English-speaking culture. English-speaking cultures generally put a lot of emphasis on creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving. So in addition to teaching your students language, you also have to teach them these skills because they won't have them. These are just a few of the many cultural differences or cultural factors that are part of our cultural context as English language teachers. If you're interested in delving further into this, I would suggest you do any research that's out there on the influence of culture on the education system. There's quite a lot of good stuff there. Just do a basic search and you'll find some good readings. I've given you a lot of information about how context influences what we do as language teachers. We've looked at the physical environment, the organizational context, and the cultural context. Now it's time for you to put this information to work. Take a look at your current teaching situation. Using the factors given in the handout, analyze the physical environment, the organizational context, and the cultural context. Take your analysis one level deeper. For each of the factors, is this factor enabling your teaching? Is it pushing back or slowing it down? Or is it creating a complete roadblock? As the final part of your analysis, look at each of these factors and decide, is it a factor you can control or a factor you can't control? If it's a factor you can't control, it's not worth spending a lot of time and effort on it. Spend your time and effort on the factors you can control, and make sure that those factors are positively influencing your teaching or enabling your teaching.